Good morning to you all. This is Monday, March 20th. We are in a new event from ABDF for a very relevant subject matter for the country, for the companies, and for the OECD. And we have some problems. We had the financial crisis, and because of that, we have the new rule, and this is very important for our economy to grow and to overcome all obstacles. Our theme is controversies on the new Brazilian transfer pricing rules under provisional measure number 1152/2022. So we have Claudia and Daniel from the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service, from Ana Carolina, Director of ABDF, and I would like to summarize a little bit that the first issue is that the importance of this provisional measure, because it's a very important moment for Brazil. Brazil is not working. When we could now prove that Brazil would be prepared considering the effort of the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service, their technical directors, and we want to congratulate these directors. And we also criticize when, for example, it takes a long time to do this legislation, and we believe that the majority for those who deal with transfer pricing, the moment is a very good moment, but also the structure of the provisional measure. So we like to have an ordinary law for then to have a new legislation. So this is considering we have a deadline. In this moment, we can prepare ourselves to be ready to this measure. And we have some perspectives to be approved by the Brazilian Congress. So for those who can stimulate or help in the approval of the provisional measure, because it would be very frustrating if we could have a provisional measure that will be feasible and will be good for us. It would be very frustrating if we could not approve this provisional measure in a reasonable time. So it's good to have an approval, or it would not be good to have a delay or a regulation change in the Congress discussions. This would not be useful for companies and for the country. So pass the floor to Ana Carolina, who will present our speakers. Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Good morning to Claudia, Daniel, Marcio, Waine, Marcos, and thank you for the participation of Claudio and Daniel from the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. Thank you, Waine and Marcio, for their partnerships, and Ernest Young to be our sponsor as well. And I would like to comment that we have a transfer pricing course. We'll have 12 classes, 37 teachers. It will be really interesting, and we hope that everybody will participate. And we have also a book. The book has been launched. You can buy the book now. It speaks about Bruna Ferrari, André Oliveira, Flávia Cavalcante, and we had the honor to coordinate this book together with Claudia Pimentel. She was together in the coordination of this book, and we are very happy to have her and to have Marcio. And our book, it's in the pre-launching phase, and it can also be bought if you want to buy it. So this is very important for our country, and I would like to congratulate the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. They had a very important role in this phase of a dialogue and transparency with the Brazilian society. This is not a current process. The Brazilian Internal Revenue Service has to be congratulated because they have this alignment process. And we are going to speak about the provisional measure 1152, 2022. And it brings us very interesting issues considering what we have in OECD. And in my opinion, they have other initiatives. We hope that we have these, we have other legislative measures to correct the taxpayers to adjust these during a surveillance process. And we hope to have more time to discuss this. We have two measures to maintain a dialogue with the society, to have this relationship with the taxpayers. So now I will I will present our speakers, and I will present them. We have together with us Claudia Pimentel. She is the Chief Deputy of the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. Daniel Prates, he's the coordinator of the Internal Taxation Department of the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. And we have Waine Peron. He is the Ernst Young Brazil tax leader. Marcio Oliveira, he's the Ernst Young Brazil leader for transfer pricing, tax, and the energy sector. And also our Marcos Catão, director of ABDF, vice-president of IFA Latam, partner of Maneira Advogados, associated to ECIGA. And now I will pass the floor to Claudia. Claudia, she will start with some introduction comments. And the idea for us is to have a conversation and questions and answers and questions for the stars of our presentation. Claudia and Daniel, they are the big stars of this morning. And I believe questions will be directed to you, I guess. So I'll pass the floor to Claudia. Good morning, Ana, Catão, Waine, Marcio, Daniel. I would like to thank ABDF for the invitation for my participation. to have the opportunity to speak about the provisional measure 1152/22. It was published last December, at the end of December, for the technical team who has been working for the last 4 years on this team. And we hear about the importance and the context of the participation of Brazil in OECD. And considering our vision and the technical team, these are one of the important, if Brazil intends to be a member of OECD, this could be a red line, an obstacle for Brazil. But Catão mentioned before that we have this change, and this is an important change concerning the investments, because in our current model, we have a double tributation in many situations, and a double taxation and a non-double taxation. And beyond this aspect, we have another aspect, which are the treaties. We notice that one of the difficulties and to have a double taxation is this disalignment, because the feeling we have is that maybe Brazil does not have this ability to eliminate these diverging rules. So there is a concern because of this lack of alignment. And another issue which is very important to Brazil, and we've heard about this about American companies as well, and how we can give credit, how we can use the tax paid by American companies concerning the resolution, which has been altered last year, and also the difficulty for Brazil to be part of the discussion on this international taxation. We've been working in the international and digital taxation. It's hard to discuss and to adhere to this discussion with this disalignment, because countries who are at the table, they have as a background that they have been applying aligned rules to these international transfer pricing rules. In the context of Brazil participating in OECD, this would be the first relevant aspect. So I'll give back the floor to you, Ana. I thank you for the invitation to participate in this important meeting. Thank you very much, Claudia. So now we'll have our conversation, this morning conversation. So I will invite Waine to start discussing. So thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you, ABDF, to promote this kind of meeting, and also for it's an honor to be part of this discussion this morning. Thank you very much for the privilege to be part of this meeting. And this transfer pricing rules, I see this as a very positive, considering 3 main aspects. It integrates Brazil in the value chain, international value chain. It avoids double taxation and non-double taxation, and it adopts the arm's length principle when they recognize this, and also the tax paid, something that changed when North American companies had investments in Brazil. And this will be better for us. Thinking about IME 2132, 2022, it adopts from January 2023. It's not the regulation of all the new rules, considering ITP, in considering the so-called arm's length principle. So we have to have a more detailed. But the Brazilian Revenue Service, they had this issue, and it seems that the new government will support this provisional measure. We were concerned because of the change of government, but we believe we will approve this new provisional measure because we intend to adopt it during 2023. We have from the 1st of September to the 30th of September. This will be a challenging time. They have to map this new provisional measure. And I can give you two examples, very simple examples. The first example will be that we can adopt, avoiding the limiting the regulations, but they define the royalties, and they see that these royalties will not be deductible. Or maybe they will have this in a non-taxation rule. And the second one would be that, and I would like to discuss this with Claudia and Danielle, relating to the reorganization when it is applied, and when it's even better if they can move this. And when we ask this question is that what could we evaluate in the restructuring transactions that we can see the Article 27 of the MP 1152-22. We have been seeing some example from the taxpayers. So are we going to have enough effective transfer of something valuable, an activity, a function, or a transference? Another question, maybe we have a renegotiation of a pre-established agreement. This value transfer would be reimbursed by the independent parts. Another issue, can we have the transfer of intangibles? Maybe we'll have this centralization of a regional, and will they reduce the, or maybe we are going to have strategies or the reduction and the ending of some issues, something that we've been discussing, and Catão remembered very well. We have the re-evaluation of the big techs, and they have a bank crisis. We've been seeing this in the US, and these are bringing us challenges. So the question I ask Claudia and Danielle, these restructuring issues, are they going to be impacted? What do you recommend to the companies to define very well this restructuring and to give the possibility to develop the new rule? I believe this question is a very relevant question. So I will comment, and I will ask Daniel to comment as well. Our rules, as they were in 1996, they had a reduced scope compared to international. We could have some goods and services and imports and exports, but the MP 1152, we adhere to international patterns, reaching out all the relationships with all the related parts. And we had this align with the international pattern, reaching out to the restructuring of all issues. And they are considered, and they consider all changes in the risks, functions, and assets, and they would be remunerated if they had some cases independent of what you have. And if you have a situation where you have a change, you have an intangible approval or the alteration of something. For example, if you have the company have this and this function is not, for example, if we have something with, if the Brazilian entity doesn't have the perspective to have this future profit, which will be allocated to a different entity. It's important to remember, Waine, that this was already priced. If you have a restructuring in the international context, could be captured by the other entity, and it had to be reflected in the master file considering this entity abroad. So, and now it has to be priced and informed considering Brazilian legislation and documentation that we are already developing together with the rest of the whole documentation of transfer pricing. And it involves another area of the Brazilian revenue service. But on one hand, this is not new for these companies, multinational companies. In terms of how it can be prepared, and probably we are going to speak more about APA. We know that this restructuring, they are the theme of one of the transactions that they need to be considered, and companies will look for a legal safety. We intend to introduce this, but what we intend to do is to put into the regulation a kind of guideline for the companies, how they can do it. And I'll pass the floor to Daniel, and Daniel can also comment. Good morning to you all. I thank you for the ABDF invitation. I thank all my colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be part of ABDF meetings. I believe Claudia spoke very well about this, and Waine also answered. And it's a very specific question. And considering this special topic, we have a new thing in our legislation. Our transfer pricing rules, they did not include this kind of transaction. And what we have now in the transfer pricing rules in OECD, we have a specific regime to treat this kind of transaction. As you know, this new legislation will try to price transactions and allocate profits according to the functional profile of every entity. If I have an entity who take risks, have several rules, and they generate intangibles, they will have a larger profit compared to those that will have routine functions and if they don't assume many risks. And this kind of entity, usually they will have some remuneration, they have a smaller remuneration, but they will have a more stable situation. This provisional measure, they will try to price or allocate profitability. In the case that you have a dislocation of functions of assets and risks among entities taking part in the same economic group. If I change the functional profile, I will change the return and what they have considering, and if I transfer this, if when you see that you have independent parts, probably they will have some profitability in here. And when you speak about business, when you think about transfer of share, and if you think about some amendments or changes, but answering your question in this kind of business, it's important to answer the questions you asked. I have to map my functional profile. I have to transfer. Is this a potential transfer? And as independent parts, how can we deal with this kind of transaction? And I have also to check which are the effects and which kind of restructuring services we have to do in this period after the provisional measure adoption. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Claudia. I'll pass the floor to Marcio. Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Thank you. I have to thank you. I have to thank ABDF and to be part of this discussion. And it's good to speak about our taxes. And I would like to thank Claudia and Danielle for the excellent work they've been doing. And I've been repeating the first time I can see this. They are engaged in this process. And I would like to thank Waine for his participation, bringing his comments and observations about the alignment. And I would like to have an introduction about this theme, how the Brazilian Revenue Service and the government is dealing with this. This provisional measure was published on December 29th, 2022. And when we had the transfer pricing legislation in 1996, we started to ask ourselves, is this going to work? And we adapted to this. And those who study tax law, we have so many doubts about the application of these new rules because they have a different dynamic. And our tax law, when we speak, and specifically speaking about transfer pricing rules, we have some doubts. We have some doubts associated to the taxation. And when we go to the OECD model, we have a dynamic, and OECD recognize this. When we have OECD guidelines, we can see the transfer pricing rules. They are not part of an exact science. And we have our first step through the amendments. We had more than 100 amendments. One or other, they speak the same, and others are new, and maybe they can bring us some concern considering the dynamic of this project. And the question I would like to ask Claudia and Danielle, considering all the amendments, which are the ones that you believe they are positive in the process and they could improve the provisional measure? And what are the ones that you could have to be more careful? And if you have to analyze the transfer pricing rules, what you could do? This is my question. I'll start commenting. You have a very interesting question. We are still evaluating the amendments. We have more than 100 amendments, and there are several of them. They have good intentions, but they are cause of concern to us. Amendments that could be, considering the technical area, we have some that try to align for example, when you speak the tax havens, for example, we have a rule that try to align with international pattern. And when we speak about amendments that we are concerned about, there is one that I believe that it will consider this regime as optional, which we can think it as a transitional rule. And this it's unacceptable considering OECD, because this will be completely disaligned with the international pattern. And this we are really concerned about. And there is another one that we are really concerned as well, because they have to have a solution. And we have a maximum deadline, and the way they work and the whole work, this doesn't work really, because if you dedicate yourself to APA to deal with complex situations, when you need to analyze economically to understand how the process is going to work, and if you have a deadline, you don't have this in anywhere in the world. And this can be an obstacle to accept the demands. So it disaligns with the international practice, and it brings some obstacles to apply this analysis. Another issue is the related parts. We have something that they try to make a list limiting these parts. And this creates a disalignment with the international practice when you have an influence of a part on the other in a way that can provoke an alteration or an influence that will interfere in the precification of the operation. So, according to our evaluation, it will be far from the OECD pattern. So, this remembering the main amendments that we will have to deal with them. And now I'll pass the floor to Daniel. Probably he can complement what I just said. As Claudia mentioned, we had the OECD team came to Brazil. They were together with us. Grace came to Brazil, and Thomas as well, and his team. And we discussed some amendments. We had an internal evaluation, and we had some of them under discussion. And our perception is that we have some efforts from the taxpayers, some areas, and the process is very interesting. But what we observe is that some amendments concern us because they bring us some obstacles, like to have the optional transactions, jurisdiction of the third parties, and also other amendments that we can mention that there is an intention to look for a guarantee. But what we notice is that the text in these discussions that we had with OECD, the text does not adhere to some rules. And what we can mention, this can bring some insecurities. And the taxpayers who presented these amendments, we understand that these amendments, we can address them and we can approach them with a comparison through some secondary legislation to avoid some imprecisions in our law. But considering the concerning amendments, we have several different ones. I'm just listing some, and we have some, the issue of the tested part. We created a Brazilian fruit. And so if the taxpayer chooses to choose another part, if they want to choose another part according to the taxpayer point of view, but even what you call the downward adjustments, after the provisional measure, we had a lot of noise involving the adjustments. And then 2132, we tried to clarify what they were mentioning. And we saw that in the amendments, the majority of them, they will have a spontaneous adjustment. And in our vision, this is true. There are a few countries that allow this. We have many countries that they have a system that they are favorable to this kind of practice. And we see that this kind of practice, they have a double taxation. Maybe the taxpayer, some taxpayers can implement some planning strategies. And so this is not something that we can adopt. We had some adjustments in a reasonable period. We can discuss this. We have the provisional measure has we have to have a financial statement, and we have to look for the better path. But to allow a spontaneous adjustment is not something desirable. And we have some concern. For example, if you have one more year for the option, or maybe if they are having payments for tax havens. And what we presented in the provisional measure is that we've been listening to the other side to understand the sensitivity of the team. So, Daniel, thank you very much for your comments. And I'd like to ask you, we have some people who have simultaneous interpretation for those. I will ask you to close your mics. Thank you very much for your participation. I believe that this question is very interesting. They are aligned with the regulation, and it depends on this channel, contact channel between associations and the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. It's very important to see that Daniel has to listen from the taxpayer, and we have different sectors. We have a block about commodities, and I think this is very important. I believe that you, Claudia and Daniel, I know you have so much to do, and if you have also the regulation and the change of the provisional measure in the Congress. And I believe that this is an institutional work from the Brazilian Internal Service. When we had the other event with Claudia and Sandro, we asked ourselves if there was a way to participate in the legislative process. And at that moment, Claudia and we mentioned that we had this provisional measure to discuss. And now, in this moment, the regulation of the possibility to have this regulation, not through a very strict process of a public consultation, but probably to contact the revenue service. And inside this, we have also a question that in spite of we had to adequate ourselves to the international pattern, the provisional measure gets a little bit larger, considering questions that are not treated in the guidelines. And the guidelines are not a source of this. But what happened is that this provisional measure, they bring us a larger group of taxpayers that will be affected by the provisional measure. We had these transfer prices, and we have a scenario that we have to consider in our economy. We have some companies that are small or medium-sized companies, and different from the multinational groups. They have a structure to have this, and we have to consider this, that what can we speak about the provisional measure if we are going to have a threshold for companies that have a capital profile of a medium-sized company, considering revenue and structures. So the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service will try to avoid the level playing field for those which are affected. If you have an idea to exclude some people from this legislation, this transfer pricing legislation. Yes, we had something, we try to simply we have a legal mechanism to have less risky transactions, very aligned with the international regulations, and probably they'll have regulations also including some smaller companies. But what we've been thinking is not seeing the Brazilian entity, but this small company can be part of a larger multinational group. And then I believe this international practice is that you have to look for this Brazilian entity, but maybe you have to see this entity as a whole, to have the possibility to be considered these companies. They are not multinational companies, but they are starting to be international Brazilian companies. They are starting to be international. This is a company that we could maybe discuss, and this simplification, it's very interesting to receive evaluation from economical sectors. They could identify transactions, and they could simplify some rules. But we could have companies that they are start to be international. They are medium-sized companies, but they are starting to be international. and they don't have the needed structure to use these transfer pricing rules. But if you consider Brazilian entities, we can have some simplification rules. If you have a company in Brazil, if they are distributors only, and Daniel can comment as well in terms of what they are telling us. Maybe if you speak about a safe haven for a low-risk distributor, and if they have a fixed profit margin, for example, for this kind of structure, but not simply to exclude them if they are part of a multinational group, of a larger group. I'll pass the floor to Daniel for him to comment.
Cláudia, eu acho que é exatamente isso, né? Você tem essa perspectiva é bem interessante, né? Porque você tem situações em que
this is a very interesting perspective because this can be a presumed profit, but the multinational group, we have a question, we have a, but if this presumed group, we have different segments, and they have CDCs. And this is interesting because, in my opinion, if you have this kind of situation, the provisional measure will simplify this, because this entity and this group will have this transfer pricing rules. For example, they have this world price policy. And what happens today, this small or medium-sized company, they have to agree with our rules. I have a presumed profit. It's not worth doing some calculation. We had a study, and this is okay. And in fact, this is not good. And probably we'll have this kind of situation. You have to apply our fixed margin. So for this kind of situation, this provisional measure will bring us some safety. We have a question here, because in several different segments, if they have a presumable profit, the question is, I have a matrix adopted abroad through APA, I have a tested method. If adopted by the company here, they have to test? Yes. You are not going to invent anything, but you have to have an initiative about this. So this is excellent. Thank you, Claudia and Daniel. What I believe is very interesting, it's to bring this provision that the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service can adopt. We had safe harbors, not with a clear provision in the law. So having this in the law and staying in the text, this is very good, because this shows us that the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service will have this goal to make the taxpayers' lives easier, because they had to face some difficulties, because they are more complex what we have today. It's practical, it's simple, and they have all the deficiencies, but they have also a virtue to be practical. And if we have this complex system looking for the arm's length, the reality of transactions, we need to have all measures to simplify and coordinate the taxpayers and the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. So, in Article 39 of our provisional measure, we are speaking about consultation process. We are trying to implement this that we call APA, the possibility to taxpayers to look for this legal safety. But also what I'd like to ask you, Claudia and Danielle, Article 39 speaks about consultation. The consultation we have today is a process where the taxpayer, they don't have the opportunity to talk to the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. The taxpayer asks, and the Brazilian Revenue Service, they answer. But we will have more complex questions. We have doubts on the side of the Brazilian Revenue Service and questions on the side of the taxpayers. So I would like to ask you some questions. We know that this will be regulated, and in this regulation, can we have a consultation process similar to APA, having a dialogue between the Brazilian Revenue Service and the taxpayer? So we have a 1-year term for this consultation, and we have many complex situations. Do we have to be concerned with the possibility for them to extend more this? Maybe the taxpayers will have some insecurity, discomfort. And my last question is, internally, are you prepared to have a dedicated team to the solution for these consultations, not linked to the fiscalization, but we are going to look for a correct result, aligned, and a good solution for all parts. So my last question would be, is this team, they are being prepared with this objective? When we spoke about this, our proposal is to have an APA, because we don't have how to do this analyze if we don't have this in the international practice. So the proposal of the technical team is to have an international pattern, and different from the general consultation about the tax and customs tax is a right of the taxpayers, and we are obliged to answer. This APA consultation, we tell that the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service maybe will not accept this because it is directed to complex cases, and the only way to obtain legal safety, because they demand the dedication of 3 auditors, for example. because to have a final agreement to really we have an economic trained team. We have to have a legal team, but people with a economy profile, because many countries, they adopt a previous meeting to check if it's an APA or not. So the taxpayer can have this previous meeting to check if this is the best way, if they will check to see if this will be the best path to really see if you can have this process. And it's good because then the taxpayer is not bringing the whole documentation. They only present this. No, this is an important situation. We can accept this as an APA. And the idea is, if this economy team can be connected to those who will have the same, for example, so if we have the contamination, for example, we have the team who launched this. If we don't have this APA, for example, it's good to have this financial team organized, that we can see this structure in the international teams, but we have a financial team and they are training to implement this measure. But they told that maybe this would not be good. We use this structure, and there are some aspects from the legislation that can be used, but we have to have a concrete analysis of the whole process. Daniel, do you have anything to add? No? Okay. Thank you, Claudia. I'm very happy because when I read the provisional measure, it's very good to really listen to you. And I will now pass the floor to Waine. Thank you, Ana and Claudia. As we mentioned before, speaking about side effects of other taxation and also customs taxation. As we know, to define the customs value, this is vital to have all the taxes involved and also to have a tax calculation. And customs values are also used for several commercial defense and anti-dumping, compensation rules, and other safeguards measurements, being the base for penalties, for example, that can be applied in imports, and they have a list in Article 698, Article 7, up to Article 712, because they have the penalty of some merchandise and some, they have another also articles dealing with this. And for example, if you have these methods, for example, we have the transaction adjusted value, and then we have imported goods, computation method, and then we have the residual method, considering reasonable criteria. And this here we have some very interesting margin to use these transference pricing rules. These transfer pricing rules concerning customs, and they originate from different international companies. We have the price that you are going to adopt, and based in this value and the variation of the practice price, you have to define, is this custom value can have to be adjusted. If this will be inferior to the parameter, this will be abandoned and this price will be adopted, and we'll have some penalties and some interesting. So this custom taxation can be if the taxpayer will import the good with a price, part of the tax profit will go abroad. But if they had a payment, but on the other hand, if the importer will adopt a tax planning with the objective to reduce the transfer pricing, maybe they will generate proofs against themselves. So this will have a certain antagonism. But the fact is, using transfer pricing as a parameter to get closer to the custom values, they've been discussing between the OECD and the international customs, speaking about transfer pricing rules. And this is a very important tool for audits. And this new ruling that it's being proposed now, this is seeking a harmony, as you mentioned very well. If we are going to evaluate the transfer price, will be classify products using the arm's length principle. And the customs ruling is a very strict rule. But the fact is, Article 2, Paragraph 2, they determine that to check the circumstance of the sales of related parties to decide the customs value, this will be the transaction value. And this was appointed in the comment number 20 through 23. And this is not the same as fixing a customs value. But this is a very important data for this. And bringing this to the Brazilian reality, for the majority of votes, we didn't have this defining, considering transfer pricing. When the other 5 methods were put apart, and you have the relationship between the foreign importer, for example, they use the transfer pricing, and they used this telling the impossibility of using the other 5 methods. And we had the residual method, because they understood that they were reasonable methods, considering the GATT agreement we had in 1994. The IN20 in 2022, they allowed the information of calculation of goods, considering transfer pricing, as a possible measure. Article 28, paragraph 1, they dispose on that if you have some doubts about the customs value, they can ask for the parameter price. But also, not everything is considering the taxation. They use the first method, for example, if the importer demonstrates that this will be linked and this will not affect the price, and they can support the transfer pricing as PLL or CPL or PCI. So there are very relevant aspects. And other relevant aspects, we have the impact of indirect taxes as well. Import price can result in the decrease of the, if we consider ICMS or special regimes that make this feasible. If you change the prices, this can have an impact in the prices, referring to the custom value. But this can be reviewed to minimize financial impacts and the demands from the fiscal authorities, and also to decrease fiscal incentives that can be impact some investment subsidized.
Desculpa te interromper, mas se você puder concluir, já fazer a pergunta. Obrigada.
Resumindo, pessoal, o novo cenário de TP
Summarizing all this, considering the arm's length, we have to harmonize all studies and transfer pricing. And I like to ask Daniel and Claudia, is there a discussion between the two teams, for those who are working with transfer pricing and customs, to harmonize if they can be better? I believe that this can be harmonized, I hope.
Vou comentar rápido, aí eu passo para o Daniel. Assim, a medida provisória,
The provisional measure it amends the legislation on corporate income tax, IRPJ, and social contribution on net profits, CSLL, to provide for transfer pricing rules. So we are working with this. And when we were commenting, we have the TMMM, but this doesn't help to evaluate, but this is a point that it's possible to have an harmonization, and we can do this in the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service, and this could be harmonized for us to make this easier for the taxpayer. Daniel, do you want to add something? Yes, this provisional measure scope is to deal with the corporate income tax and the social contribution on net profits. Our goal was to restrict the rules on the corporate income tax and social contribution on net profits. So we are trying to precify this with a 5% margin. I have this kind of situation. But in this measure that we had by the beginning of February, we intend to have a discussion because we want to tell you that if you have an adjustment to determine these transfer pricing rules, will not reflect in calculating other taxes. But you can have situations when you are going to have some impacts. I had the transaction today, and by the end of the year, I will try to update the value of my transaction. So I can specify the same transaction. This can have an effect, but there are situations that you have an adjustment when you use a TMM, trying to have a rentability, but considered all business, and this will be hard for this kind of situation to have a connection, specific items, and in this case, you have some complications to do this readjustment in custom taxes. We try to separate, but we understand that this is a subject matter that deserves more discussion and a detailed discussion. Thank you, Claudia and Daniel. Now, Catão, please. So maybe we'll have to have more meetings and to update the perspective of the US to accept the imposed credit. You have the TD 9959, but we have to consider the royalties. Do you have any update on this? Marcio, you have a broader universe and you work with that. I don't know how companies and how American companies and also the posture of Brazil, considering our taxation. Are the companies accommodating well, or are they creating provisions? Claudia, Daniel, and Marcio. Can you speak about this, please? About the gravity of this situation? Well, we've been talking with the American Treasurer, and AmCham is also talking to them. And this resolution and this alteration affected the credit, Brazilian credit, and tax paid in Brazil. So what we've been explaining, part of the provisional measure, and we are speaking also with the American financial sector to make their analysis easier, how to deal with the transference rules. We didn't have a return, but the contact was very positive and the relevance of this change, but we are waiting for this to go on with these talks. I don't know if Daniel wants to comment on this. Yes, we've been discussing with them to present the legislation, to check if they have any concern. And the first issue that we've been looking for the option, the taxpayer who tried to anticipate the option for 2023, if this will be enough for their credit, it's to have this, and other aspects of the legislation that can create some kind of concern. We believe that our legislation is aligned. The issue of royalties, we understand the taxpayer's concern, but we have some protection measure as well, considering the US regulation. But we are open to discuss this. Claudia has been contacting them to discuss this with them. This fund tax credit, we've seen this in discussions in academia and Brazilian companies. And Brazilian companies would be more expensive when they are discussing with American companies, considering the Brazil cost. But we have to check to see the other side of the coin. This problem was created by the North American government. And certain measures, North American companies, they don't want to pay more tax. And this is something that was caused by the North American government. North American companies will be less competitive compared to European and Japanese competitors. If I'm a Brazilian company and I have a similar company that can be provided by an European company, I'll contract the European company and not the American company. So this burden, the North American government, so when we speak about
E a gente também deve lembrar o seguinte, o alinhamento com o princípio arm's length, ele acaba, assim, em certa medida, ajudando o reconhecimento do crédito, imposto de renda, né, nos Estados Unidos. Só que o problema em relação ao imposto de renda retido na
For example, when we have this text,
né, de onde você gera riqueza, no Brasil ou lá fora. Então, pela regra
if, where are you generating richness?
Então, o problema vai parcialmente continuar, tá?
So this income tax, the North American companies, if they will deal with that in the same, probably they will have to assume this cost.
Excelente, excelente. Márcio, não sei, o Catão quer fazer mais algum comentário ou o Márcio já faz a última pergunta dele, Catão?
Não, só comentário rápido sobre isso, Márcio, assim, total razão. A única questão é que, embora a regra dos TDs americanos, ela permite,
So we have these rules. They will have a bilateral safe harbor. And this is an issue for the American government. I don't know up to a certain point. I'm not pressing the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service team. From Latin American countries, because of the financial pressure, Brazil can have a deduction at source. You have to accept our rules. But this will put everybody in the same place. But if you don't deduct the credit, the gross up here, but I don't believe that. I think this is a North American issue, and I hope Brazilian government will overcome this. So I'll ask Claudia and Daniel. During the process of the discussion of the change in the transfer pricing rules, the Asian taxpayers were asked to contribute and to look for safe harbor areas where they could simplify the documentation process. We know that this process has more complexity, and they have this functional analysis, what are the risks and functions, and we try to define this, and I have to select a profitable steps, and some of them will depend on this, and they'll demand a extra effort. What we do, maybe we can use here in Brazil. We've been listening to this. Oh, I do this documentation there, and I use this in Brazil, and we have a compliance cost. If you have a documentation that will be useful to another jurisdiction, we need to solve the dispute. So this is not different from what we perceive in another situation. So we have to take into consideration local aspects when we speak about transfer pricing rules. The Brazilian Internal Revenue Service tried to simplify. Claudia and Daniel, can you see in the context of this, what you received and what you discussed with OECD, what we can do from the point of view when you had this subject matter, how can deal with this? Are there some safe harbors areas? Did they have any transfer? If they have a revenue below a certain point, is there something that you've been thinking about this?
Márcio, eu vou começar a responder e vou passar para o Daniel também, que eu acho que ele vai poder dar também.
I will start to answer.
O que se pretende em termos da
what we intend, as we mentioned, regulation, we have a public consultation. We have to discuss with different sectors, different area. We had the slides, and we showed the main part, discussing with entities, trying to bring this provisional measure. We don't want to publish a surprise. And relating to the safe harbor, we intend to evaluate these, want to receive suggestions, new suggestions, in order to evaluate some simplifications of this normative instruction for us, or what we can introduce and what we can bring to the system. We are open to a discussion. We want to listen and we want to simplify. Now I'll pass the floor to Daniel. The idea, Marcio and colleagues, we want to bring measurements and procedures to simplify this, align with what we have nowadays in the international practice. We don't intend to have our current margins with a safe harbor or to introduce margins to have this for all sectors. This is not what we intend, because this will not bring an alignment, but we understand that this can simplify several different sectors. We can have situations that we can direct the method we will choose, and the best method will be this or that. So we want to simplify and choose the best method, to select the best method. And I think it's also possible to bring safe harbors with some margins, specific margins, but again, but not using the same model. For example, as Claudia mentioned, we have a very relevant project, which is amount B, that has been discussed in OECD countries. They will try to simplify the transfer pricing rules, and they'll have different possibilities of results that are discussed there. And maybe we'll have a result to indicate the best method for taxpayers, low-risk distributors, and have eventual returns, considering some financial features, financial activity areas, asset intensity. It's a refined safe harbor because they have a determined class of assets, and they direct the how to choose the method and some specific profitability or specific revenues. And maybe for small transactions, taxpayers, and we can also design specific safe harbors. It's important that these areas come to talk to us for us to work on these areas. And for us, for our own initiative, I'll design a safe harbor for this area without knowing their specificity. In this new model, we'll need to define what can be part of this, and we can only do this, we'll do this if we have this discussion with this area. Excellent, Daniel, Claudia, Marcio. We'll have to wrap up, and I will have a final question. We still have 10 minutes more. We know that this provisional measure is long, but we depend at the end of the day from a normative instruction. And we are anxious to analyze this. And my question will be, in the alignment process with the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service, they went on discussing with the society, with taxpayers, are we going to have the opportunity to analyze a future normative instruction? Are they elaborating this? Because this is a very complex. And if provisional measure will be a law, when are we going to edit the law? Yes, we've been working with this, and the idea is to discuss and to have a public consultation and discuss with all sectors. And our proposal is to have this and to have this published with enough time for the taxpayer to understand if they are going to, if the provisional measure will become a law by the end of June, and probably we'll need some adjustments. And we hope to be this published by the end of June, beginning of July. And this for the companies to be able to opt by September. This is our perspective. Excellent, Claudia. We are anxious. We want to see this. So now we have a wrap-up. Marcio, some final comments, maybe? Why I admire Claudia's optimism when I see that 700 pages from OECD trying to organize and structure the whole complexity. I think this will be a huge challenge because we are not speaking about transfer pricing rules. We are speaking about the care. We have to take care of this and to have this. And this care, this will be very important for us to avoid this legal insecurity and to discuss objectively. So I hope we'll have this, and I hope this will be discussed with the society. And I believe that all sectors, with all the, and I hope that this, we can really improve this discussion. Thank you. Now, Waine, please.
Obrigado, Ana. Como eu
Thank you, Ana. As I mentioned, I see this in a positive way. I have transfer pricing, and apparently this is still far, but we are in a hurry. So we recommend that this analysis to be done as fast as possible to avoid surprise at the end. The Brazilian Internal Service, Revenue Service, they have a brilliant work. They've been doing a wonderful job. They are dealing with companies, and this is a very important milestone for the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service. So let's make the best of it. Let's implement the precautions, the needed precautions. When we arrive in 2024, to be ready. This is my last message. Thank you. Thank you very much. Catão? I think I want to repeat what Waine. It's not because Claudia and Daniel are here. They are doing a wonderful service to Brazil. They have a wonderful role. They have a wonderful institutional role, and we are going to support them. We intend to approve this provisional measure, and if we approve the provisional measure, we will give an international lesson. So I would like to thank Waine, Marcio, Claudia, Daniel, and our director, Ana Carolina. So thank you, Marcos Catão, and Claudia and Daniel. So please. I think I talked too much. Thank you very much for the invitation. You, Catão, Waine, Marcio, and everybody, and the audience, thank you very much. And I believe that this is a huge challenge, but we intend to regulate, and certainly we will need to go on. We have to have a regulation to apply it immediately, and we have to improve this in time. So this will not end next June. This is an ongoing process. So, Daniel, please.
Não, Cláudia, eu ia falar antes para você encerrar, mas então, de novo, eu agradecer o convite, né?
Again, I like to thank the ABDF invitation. It's an honor to be here in this panel. So, and thank you for the audience, and to reinforce what I've been telling you. We have to maintain this dialogue channel open to discuss amendments, concerns, and other interesting themes. So for those who have the interest, they can reach out to us to discuss. And the next steps, the idea is to maintain the dialogue and to discuss the elaboration of this normative instruction, and to have a public consultation to have more transparency and efficacy to this process. So I'd like to thank you all. It's an honor to be with you. We will have several other meetings, I hope, after the approval of the provisional measure, after the regulation. It's a new Brazil, a new world, and this communication channel with the Brazilian Internal Revenue Service then with the society is very important. So thank you for your work. Thank you, Waine, Marcio, Catão, Claudia, Daniel, Marcio. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Obrigada.